Dobar dan. Želim sve da vas pozdravim u ime Filozofskog fakulteta u Beogradu, Odeljenja za sociologiju i feminističke sekcije sociološkog društva, koji su koorganizatori ovog predavanja, profesora Ričarda Mola, koji predaje na School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, University College London, i koji je ljubazno pristao da nam povodom svog boravka u Beogradu održi jedno predavanje na našem fakultetu. Profesor Mol će nam danas govoriti o LGBT migrantima u Londonu i Berlinu, o jednom većem istraživanju koje je sproveo. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. I have no idea what you said, but I'm sure it was all very nice. Thank you, Isadora, for organising this and for inviting me to speak here today. So I'm going to be talking about two projects, actually, that I've been conducting over the past 4 years. The most recent one, which is still ongoing, is the top one, which looks at the experience of LGBT Poles, Russians and Brazilians in London and Berlin. It's more qualitative than quantitative. It's based on 125 interviews which I did in Berlin and London over the past 3 years. There's a smaller quantitative arm based on 800 questionnaires. And this was funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. The second project is a project I did with the medical school at UCL, and it was a project on, particularly on sort of the sexual health of East European migrants in London, but we also sort of asked them about their attitudes towards a range of sort of sexual issues. And that was much, because it was sort of run by the medics, they were sort of much more interested in statistical data, so it was a much larger quantitative section based on over 2,500 questionnaires and a smaller number of in-depth interviews. And that was funded by our Medical Research Council. With regard to the top project, all of the interviews are done, are transcribed, but I'm now slowly working my way through the coding, so that is ongoing. So what I'm going to be talking about today are more preliminary observations rather than a fully fleshed out argument. So the overall aim of the research and what I'm going to be talking about today is looking at the relationship between sexuality and migration, particularly looking at the extent to which an individual's sexual orientation was a factor in their decision to move overseas, and then what influence the actual process of migration, of living in a different culture, had on the way that they performed and understood their sexuality. There has been a little bit of research done on the relationship between sexuality and migration, primarily with reference to the United States and primarily with reference to Latin American migrants. But much of that research was about actually getting across the border, less to do with their sort of integration strategies sort of once they arrived in the US. So what I was sort of more interested in was sort of what happened once they got into the destination country. The extent to which they sought to maintain their cultural, linguistic identities, and the processes by which they sought to do that. And I'm particularly interested in the concept of diaspora, the extent to which sort of pre-existing communities of the same ethnic cultural group was sort of helped them sort of maintain identities and provided sort of economic, social and cultural support. And then the final thing I was interested in looking at was the impact of migration on attitudes towards sexuality. So this relates to the project I did with the medical school, where we asked a broad range of migrants, so over 2,500 East European migrants, predominantly heterosexual migrants, how their attitudes towards homosexuality changed as a result of them moving to the United Kingdom. So I came to this project from migration. I was sort of initially a migration scholar and became interested in sexuality sort of later on. And migration, when you're sort of examining the reasons for migration, it's still very much couched in economic terms. Neoclassical migration theory would argue that the reason people move abroad is to improve their economic and cultural capital, so to earn more money and to learn new skills. But when I was sort of reading this and teaching this, it sort of seemed to me that that wouldn't necessarily be the case for all migrants. I thought for LGBT migrants there would be issues other than simply learning new skills, earning more money, that would sort of play into their sort of decision to leave. Obviously, learning sort of new skills and earning money was important for all migrants, but I figured that that wasn't sort of telling the whole story for LGBT migrants. And this sort of appeared to me to be the case, firstly, if you sort of looked at legal equality for LGBT individuals across Europe. In no country in Europe do LGBT citizens have exactly the same rights as the broader citizen population, but there's significant variation across Europe. Britain, currently, the league tables sort of change every year, but currently the UK is doing pretty well. 82% of the rights, LGBT citizens have 82% of the rights that the broader population has. And at the other end of the scale you have Russia, where LGBT citizens only have 6% of the same rights as the heterosexual population. And then Poles are sort of not quite as bad, but sort of clearly not as good as sort of many other countries. So I figured that that would be sort of perhaps one motive. This was sort of before I'd sort of started the research. These were just sort of some assumptions I was sort of making to sort of guide my research questions. The fact that not having legal equality might be an incentive for moving abroad. But I thought probably even more important would be social attitudes towards homosexuality. And in Russia, this was a survey that was carried out quite recently in 2013, and attitudes towards homosexuality are not particularly positive and have got worse. So 85% of Russians are against same-sex marriage, which is not the worst figure. There are sort of worse figures than that elsewhere in Europe. But more sort of worrying was the belief that homosexuality is understood as a psychological condition, and 22% of Russians believe that it should be treated, that it should be compulsory to undergo psychiatric treatment if you're homosexual. And then even more worrying, 5% of Russians believe that homosexuals should be exterminated. In Poland, attitudes weren't quite so bad. This is sort of quite an old chart. It's from about 8 years ago. And attitudes have changed for the better in Poland. But these would be sort of the attitudes in play when people that I interviewed were sort of thinking about sort of migrating. And this was sort of asking the question whether or not you think gay people should be allowed to get married. And Poland was sort of at the bottom, towards the bottom of the chart, with just sort of 17%. So actually not that different from Russia. So this was sort of some of the assumptions that I had. Sort of attitudes and lack of legal equality would be sort of some of the reasons that people were migrating. So to start with the context of Russia, the people that responded to the questionnaire, over half of them had experienced homophobic verbal abuse, and more worrying, over a fifth of them had experienced homophobic violence. So my university is always saying my research needs to have more impact, so they'll be very pleased about this. Now, where did we get to? Okay, we got to this. Now that's the Russian flag, although I understand it can double up for other flags in Eastern Europe. So as I was saying, sort of 56% of the respondents that answered my survey who were from Russia or other Russian, who were sort of Russian-speaking from other post-Soviet states, had experienced verbal abuse, and over a fifth had personal experience of homophobic violence. And because of that, because of the situation, over 2/3 of them were not out to anybody at all. And of those that were out, 20% were only out to close friends. And primarily, it was only out to other gay people. So Ivan, for example, said the only people who knew I was gay were gay themselves. My colleagues didn't know, my parents didn't know, my straight friends didn't know. I don't look gay by Russian standards, so it wasn't a problem. But for Kostya, it was a problem. He said he was also not openly gay to anybody, but he says, you can tell I'm gay. I can't hide it. It's my nature. So what am I supposed to do? So sort of whether or not an individual was out, whether an individual even identified themselves as being gay, was less important than the way that they were perceived, whether or not they were sort of perceived as being gay. So for Kostya, his sexuality was sort of written on his body, and so the process of coming out was actually, for him, irrelevant. So this was sort of one of the reasons that sort of people wanted to move, but initially they didn't necessarily want to leave their homelands. All of the people that I spoke to sort of started off in a sort of a small provincial town and then moved to their capital city, or to sort of one of the major cities. So in the Russian case, they came from all over Russia, and initially they moved to either Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Kiev in Ukraine. And so the first sort of thing in their mind was not to leave the country. It wasn't to go abroad, it was just to try and live a more sort of happy life sort of somewhere else. And so Tanya sort of summed it up very well. She came from quite a small city, and she said everybody knew everybody's business. You know, everybody knew my parents or my grandparents, and it was sort of very difficult for her to live with her girlfriend in this small town. So initially, they chose to move to St. Petersburg. Because St. Petersburg is a sort of a much larger city, it was easier for them to be anonymous and to sort of live how they wanted, at least initially. Eventually, that also didn't work out, and so they then moved to Berlin. And it was the same with Pyotr. Pyotr initially had no intention of leaving Russia. He had a good life in Russia. He had his own business, he sort of earned quite a lot of money, he had a close circle of friends. He wasn't out to his family, and he wasn't out to the people he worked with, but nevertheless he had a good life and didn't plan to leave Russia. It was only when he started travelling and he had a comparison to make with the way that gay people live their lives in sort of other countries and the way that gay people live their lives in Russia, that he felt that sort of living abroad would enable him to sort of be more open, to be able to so I set myself the goal of living in a city, in a country where you don't have to hide your orientation, you don't have to be afraid of anything, and where you can be who you want to be, which is why he chose to move to Berlin. But very few people that I spoke to, it was immediately, that is what I want to do, I want to leave Russia. It was usually sort of a stage in their thinking. In Poland, the Polish gay respondents, LGBT respondents, were more likely to have experienced homophobic verbal abuse, but violence was sort of much lower in Poland. And so they were not choosing to move abroad to escape violence, but again it was sort of more this idea of wanting to sort of live their lives on their own terms. And there was a sort of a number of reasons that came up again and again in the interviews of what life was like for a gay person in Poland. And the thing I heard sort of most repeatedly was that the cultural norms on gender, sort of ideas of masculinity, femininity in Poland were sort of very conservative and sort of quite rigid. And so Adam said that sort of people would comment on the way that he looked, the way that he dressed, the way that he acted. He said that more often than not there was no malice, but he still sort of felt uncomfortable. He was made to feel that he didn't belong in Poland. Also, the fact that there was sort of very little representation of homosexuality in the media or in culture, and if there was representation, it was not very often positive. So this is sort of links into the research that Tanya and Isadora will be doing on representations of LGBT in the media. And Czesław, he sort of remembered watching Dawson's Creek. I don't know if Dawson's Creek came to Serbia, but it was an American sort of teen sort of soap opera. And for him, it was sort of amazing that they had an openly gay character who was treated sort of sensitively, positively, and for this to be shown on main-time American television and sort of really targeted at teenagers, sort of older children, he thought that this was sort of something sort of quite amazing and something that didn't exist in Poland. And then the third thing that sort of came up as a sort of a reason for sort of not feeling comfortable at home in Poland was the sexualization of homosexuality. From the sort of the broader sort of media, just an association with sex. The only thing that is specific about homosexuality is sex. But he argued that this was also true once he was sort of an older sort of respondent, and so he sort of came out sort of in the 90s, and he said that even in the gay press, he remembers the first gay magazine being produced in Poland, and he said that was also all about sex. And sort of the new clubs and bars that opened up in sort of Warsaw and Krakow were mainly about sex. And so for him, he thought, if I ever want to have a relationship, that is not something that I can imagine happening in Poland. So Czesław sort of summed up what a lot of people were saying. He said, I think homosexuality just plants this thing in your head that you're not going to be free unless you go somewhere where you're accepted. Obviously, all of the people that I spoke to had already made the decision to migrate, and that is not to say that the only way you can sort of live your life as an LGBT person is by migrating. There is clearly sort of a number of different strategies, but the people I spoke to all decided to sort of move abroad in order to live their lives the way they wanted to. In determining where to go to, for the Poles, it wasn't an issue, given that I was sort of looking at Berlin and London, and Poles all had the sort of the right to live and work in London. With regard to the Russian speakers, it was more problematic. But you can see that Germany is home to the biggest Russian-speaking community outside of Ukraine in Europe. There are over 1.2 million Russian speakers in Germany, compared with just 35,000 in the UK. So Germany was a key destination of the LGBT migrants. Far more LGBT migrants in Russian speakers in Berlin than in London. And part of it was to do with, there were sort of four main groups of LGBT Russians that I spoke to. The first were Volga Germans. So these were ethnic Germans who sort of hundreds of years ago moved to Russia. But because of Germany's sort of very blood-based citizenship laws, if you could prove that you were ethnically German and you could trace your lineage back to Germany, you got preferential treatment for citizenship and residency. And so a lot of the Russians I spoke to had German surnames, sort of came from German sort of descent. So for them, moving to Germany was sort of much easier than moving to any other country in the EU. And secondly, because of its history, obviously Germany also offers a preferential visa regime for Jews. And so again, a lot of the Russians I spoke to were Russian Jews who used the opportunity to move to Germany. And some went initially to Israel and then to Germany, but many sort of went directly to Germany. For the others, for those that weren't either Jewish or Volga Germans, they mainly used their high sort of cultural capital or their high economic capital. And so a lot of the people I spoke to were researchers, were students doing PhDs, who used their ability to get a student visa to enter the country, and once they were there, they would sort of work out a way of staying. And then the final group were those who had sort of done all of their education in Russia or another post-Soviet state, and then used their skills to get a job in London or in Berlin. Given that so few of the Russians I spoke to were out in their home country, I asked whether, sort of once they moved to sort of Berlin or to London, whether they then used that as an opportunity to come out to their families at home. And actually, of those that were not out before they migrated, very few of them came out afterwards. I think part of it was because they didn't know whether they would be going back. Some of them sort of living quite transnational lives. They were sort of travelling back and forth between Russia, particularly in Berlin, and therefore they felt that the sort of situation with their family hadn't changed that much, even though they were sort of now no longer living in Russia. Their relationship with the family was sort of much the same. Given the, as we've seen tonight, the tension between homosexuality and nationalism is something that is sort of quite common across the region. I asked whether sort of maintaining a sense of Russian national identity was important to them, and it was for almost all of them, particularly sort of maintaining language, but also for maintaining other sort of cultural values. Now, in the literature on migration, this is when you'd sort of look at the concept of diaspora. So diasporas are sort of very often used as means of sort of maintaining your sort of language, your culture, your identity, and also a sort of a sense of community. I'll discuss that in a little bit. Freedom was something that the Polish respondents sort of talked about. We want to sort of move out of Poland to Berlin and to London so that we can be more free. But when they were talking about freedom, it wasn't the legal freedoms that were more prevalent in the UK. Sort of the freedom to adopt, the freedom to get married, that wasn't something that sort of motivated them. That was sort of less interesting. For them, it was more sort of little freedoms. Just the ability, as Bartosz says, to sort of wear skinny jeans without being sort of shouted at in Poland. With Anka, she sort of had a shaved head, and she said in Poland that just sort of got a lot of abuse. She said just being able to walk down the street in London and nobody thinking that there's anything weird about me, and that was the sort of the small freedom that she was particularly interested in. So the ability to perform her sexuality in that sense. In terms of intimacy, again, just sort of small freedoms. So Adam was sort of talking about you know, those little gestures, holding hands or sitting close to somebody on a bench somewhere. So this was sort of something that he wanted when he sort of moved abroad. It wasn't the need to sort of marry his partner or to sort of adopt children. It was just to sort of be able to sort of hold hands in public. But what sort of again came up with a lot of the polls was that London in particular was is a huge city, and it's very easy to sort of get lonely, to sort of be isolated, and again the need for diaspora, the other need for diaspora, not simply to sort of maintain sort of language or identity, but as a sense of support, a support network, sort of psychological support, social support. Again, the concept of diaspora would seem to fit very well here. But diaspora studies focuses particularly on sort of etno-national understandings of diaspora. Now I could talk for an entire hour about the concept of diaspora. It's a concept that has been sort of stretched and sort of applied to a whole host of particular situations. The American sociologist Rogers Brubaker referred to the diaspora because the concept had been sort of scattered and used so extensively. But he argues that there are sort of three main concepts that all diasporas should share, however you're sort of using the term, whether sort of more metaphorically or more sort of agentically. First of all, there needs to be a sort of an idea of dispersion. that you've come from your homeland and you've spread to sort of at least 2 countries abroad. There needs to be a sense of homeland orientation, and so your identity, your solidarities are still in some way linked to your homeland. You don't sort of assimilate, and your loyalty is entirely sort of shifted towards the destination society. And also a sense of boundary maintenance. So in some sense you do maintain your own language, your identity and culture. You don't assimilate entirely into the society, the identity of the destination country. And so migrants, particularly sort of in the early years, will very often try to establish links with the diaspora, particularly if they don't speak the language of the destination society particularly well. In that sense, the diaspora members can help them find work, can help them sort of work with the legal issues, knowing which forms to fill, or sort of simple things like giving them a sofa to sleep on while they're sort of looking for their own apartment. But it also sort of has a more psychological function, just sort of being among your own language community, sort of maintaining your own cultural norms, speaking your own language. This is sort of another sort of key function of diasporas. But traditionally, diasporas are very much defined by a shared ethno-national identity. And very often, ethno-national identities are used to legitimate sort of anti-gay rhetoric and violence, as we have ample evidence of tonight. Also, diasporas sort of exist on the basis of networks, and also on sort of the basis of institutions, particularly sort of Saturday schools, sort of cultural centres, and the church is often a sort of a key sort of locus of diasporic community. So the fact that sort of ethno-national identities are often very homophobic, the fact that none of the LGBT people I spoke to had children and therefore had no need to sort of engage with the Saturday schools, none of them were, even if they were sort of religious, they weren't sort of practicing, so again the church wasn't really sort of available to them or sort of attractive to them. So for this reason, the ethnic diaspora, sort of in theory, shouldn't be sort of particularly sort of welcoming space for LGBT people. And when I was speaking to the Russians about, who all sort of expressed an interest in maintaining their sort of language and culture, whether then they engaged with the Russian ethno-national diaspora in Berlin, none of them, or very few of them, had anything to do with it. In Berlin, the majority, the largest part of the Russian diaspora are those who are Volga Germans, who use the opportunity to sort of come to Germany, but they're sort of socially and economically among the most marginalised of the sort of the migrant communities in Berlin. And if we sort of divide diaspora into sort of 2 different sort of concepts, to use Steve Vertovertz's distinction, first of all, diaspora as a social form, so by that he would mean a sort of an actual group, a community. And here it is the Volga Germans, the sort of the marginalised, socially marginalised Volga Germans who constitute the largest group. So they would sort of constitute the diaspora as a social form to a large extent. And Gleb had sort of gone to events where they were in the majority, and his attitude towards that was not very positive. Oh, it's just awful. It reminds me of the Russia I left behind. Drunk, uncivilized people, swearing. Exactly what I wanted to escape from. And the problem is that they live in ghettos. So for the older generation, I can only assume that they think they're still there. So they think they're still in Russia. So the sort of the socially and economically marginalised were not well integrated into German society, and because of that, the sort of the ideas that were sort of prevalent in Russia, they've sort of taken with them, and sort of no new ideas have sort of emerged as a result. Also, Natasha was saying that she doesn't go to Russian restaurants. There are a lot of Russian restaurants in Berlin. Some of them are sort of targeted more at tourists or at Germans, but there are some that are sort of run by Russians for Russians, and she said that she doesn't like going there. She certainly wouldn't go there with a girlfriend because it's the sort of atmosphere is the same sort of atmosphere that she felt when she was living in Russia. The second understanding would be more as a form of consciousness. So even if you don't want to be part of the Russian group, the Russian community, nevertheless you might still identify with the Russian culture sort of when you're living overseas. But again, some of them found that problematic because the Russian embassy in Berlin was sort of very active in sort of hosting cultural events. There's a House of Russian Culture, which again sort of works with the embassy to sort of host a number of sort of Russian events, sort of promoting Russian culture. But Andrei sort of expressed the opinion that what the embassy and the House of Culture do is kind of absolute. This is authentic Russian culture. So it was a very sort of traditional, very sort of inflexible understanding of what Russian culture should be. Sort of based very much on sort of the old classics of, sort of Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky. There was no sort of more modern sort of queer sort of understandings of identity that they could identify with. So the etno-national diaspora community didn't really sort of hold much appeal to the Russian LGBT people I spoke to. So potentially, LGBT migrants would run the risk of being doubly marginalised. So as ethnic minorities in the host society, but also as sexual minorities within their diasporic communities. So while the first one would apply to sort of a lot of sort of migrants, they might feel sort of alienated, alone in the host society, they would at least sort of have the opportunity to interact with the diasporic community. But if you're LGBT, that opportunity is often not available to you. So potentially then, LGBT migrants might face a sort of a difficult decision. Either if their Russian identity was important to them, do they hide their sexuality in order to sort of take part in Russian diasporic events? Or if their sexuality is important to them, should they then sort of minimise their sort of Russian identity and engage more with the German and the British communities? Now, when I sort of spoke to my interviewees, neither of those options was preferable. For them, both their sexual and their Russian identities were important, and because of that, they wanted to create. They were interested in creating a sense of diaspora community, but a queer diaspora community. So this is when the concept of queer diaspora sort of, I think, becomes useful. Now, there's very little been written on queer diaspora, but what has been written, they use the term in quite different ways, two quite different ways. First of all, it's understood as the diasporization of queer culture and politics, so a shared sense of identity among people across national boundaries on the basis of a shared sexual identity, or sort of a queer sort of identity. And the second understanding is sort of taking the ethnic diaspora but queering it. So finding a space within the ethnic diaspora for sexual minorities. And of the Russians that I spoke to, it was the second one, they were sort of much closer to the second one. They were sort of very active, so they were involved in queer politics, but it was almost exclusively targeted towards Russia. And so their solidarity with LGBT individuals in Russia was derived more from a shared sense of ethnic identity, not just a shared sexual identity. Also, they'd had a rather sort of negative experience of working with German LGBT activists, who they found to be sort of rather condescending, because Germany had a sort of a much longer experience of LGBT activism. They felt that they were sort of being patronised. You know, this is how you do activism. We know you're new to this. So they were concerned that if you take the Russian sort ofness out of the queer diaspora, then it simply reproduces Western and non-Western hierarchies, with the Germans and the Dutch and the British sort of trying to sort of teach the East Europeans how to do activism. So in terms of a Russian queer diasporic consciousness, the one group that I sort of focused on was known as kvartira. Now, kvartira is the Russian word for apartment, and it was created out of the word queer and the word art, because a lot of the founder members were queer artists. And kvartira, sort of meaning apartment, also sort of conveys this sort of idea of home, of safe space. And now whether or not it sort of ticks the boxes of a real diaspora, I think it does. First of all, it offers the same sort of support to its members. It offers psychological support, social support, economic support. They meet once every 2 weeks, just as a sort of a social event, so people can sort of speak Russian. They can talk about their girlfriends and boyfriends in Russian, which they feel they couldn't do in sort of other more traditional diasporic settings. There's a trained psychologist. One of the members just happens to be a trained psychologist, so if they're sort of having sort of problems, then psychological support is on hand. There's some economic support, so helping them sort of find work, for example. They maintain an ethno-linguistic boundary with the host society, which they do. Their meetings take place in a German LGBT centre, but all of their meetings take place in Russian. They said that I could go along and participate, or at least observe, but they wouldn't switch out of Russian. They said I would need to keep up with my Russian. And finally, the Homeland Orientation. They demonstrate loyalty to and solidarity with LGBT in Russia. So they do sort of a lot of activism work, but it is specifically directed at Russia. And one good example of this was called the Rainbow Flash Mob. It took place in Tiergarten, which is the park in the centre of Berlin. We all met, we sort of got rainbow-coloured balloons filled with helium. We signed messages of support, and then we released them. But what I think was particularly interesting was that sort of across Russia, activists were doing the same. They were sort of releasing balloons with sort of messages of support for sort of other Russians. And so it was a good way for sort of activists in Germany and in Russia to do simultaneous activism, to sort of show solidarity and links between the activists abroad and the activists in Russia. And particularly for the Russians, it was a means of doing activism without the general Russian population knowing what they were doing. So it was a safe way of sort of doing activism. One of the key concepts in diaspora is, again, it's this idea of home or homeland. And again, this was something that came up again and again. The very idea, the name, kvartira, means home, means apartment. So conveying this sort of safe place for you. And also, in the Lesbian and Gay Festival, it's a sort of quite a commercial sort of festival, but if you're a member of a charity or an NGO, you're given a free tent, and you can use it to sort of attract new members. And there was a competition, so whoever had the best tent would win a prize. So we decided to decorate it as a Soviet communal apartment, a kommunalka. And so people brought in things that sort of every sort of Soviet apartment would have. You know, there was a samovar, there was a collection of Dostoevsky books, sort of unopened, but sort of on the shelf. And then there was, you know, we had sort of pictures of Tchaikovsky and sort of other sort of Russian gay icons. You know, there was the fridge with the to-do list. So, you know, buy milk, take out the trash, end patriarchy, and other sort of thing. And it was something that we sort of noticed that, you know, other sort of Russian speakers or other people from other post-Soviet republics, they sort of instantly sort of recognized it from afar and came over. And so it was a good way of, again, sort of showing this idea of home from a particularly sort of Soviet, post-Soviet, Russian, but also queer context. But when they were sort of talking about home, they sort of, even the sort of the concept of home was queered, because in most diaspora literature, the home is sort of where you've left. Home is always going to be sort of Russia. But for them, home was a destination. It wasn't a point of origin. So if home is somewhere sort of comforting or safe, for them that was no longer Russia, it was now Berlin. So as one of my respondents said, in Russia there's a saying, your home is your castle. In other words, it's the place where you feel safe and comfortable, and for me that's Berlin. And so when I was sort of understanding the attempts of the sort of the Russian-speaking LGBT community in Berlin to sort of maintain identities, to sort of maintain links with the homeland, this idea of queer diaspora I thought was a very useful heuristic for sort of understanding their sort of diasporic consciousness. Now, when it came to the Poles, it was a sort of a very different story. In general, the Poles were had much less of a diasporic consciousness than did the Russians, although there were significant differences between the Poles in Berlin and the Poles in London. The Poles in Berlin had practically no sense of diasporic consciousness. And the thing that I heard again and again was, well, you know, if I feel homesick for Berlin, if I feel homesick for Poland, if I want Polish food, Polish culture, if I want to speak Polish, I'll go to Poland. I can get on a train and be home in 3 hours. And that is what a lot of them did. Almost a quarter of them went home to Poland at least once a month, whereas that percentage was only 3% in the UK. So there wasn't such a need to sort of keep their identities alive. And there was one respondent in Szczecin, which is sort of right on the border between Poland and Germany. And he didn't even consider himself a migrant. He considered himself sort of living within that sort of general region. So he would commute back and forth. He would go clubbing in Berlin and then just get a train home. So again, he didn't sort of feel the need to sort of establish contacts with Poles in Berlin. In London, they were much more likely to engage sort of with the diasporic population, or sort of have a sense of sort of diasporic community. Although some of them were sort of very critical of those Poles who only associated themselves with other Poles. Dariusz was sort of talking about his friends who lived in Manchester, and he said, you know, I don't want to live in any kind of ghettos. We've got friends who buy everything in Polish stores. They live in northern England and they buy toilet paper in Polish stores. I mean, you've got to buy toilet paper, but that's weird. So for those, they sort of found they didn't understand why Poles would only want to associate themselves with sort of Poles, only live in a Polish community. But nevertheless, they were sort of much more likely, they were more likely to specifically seek out Polish people with whom to socialise, and in particular, they were much more likely than the Poles in Berlin to visit a Polish venue. And that would include anything from the church, Saturday school, cultural centre, or even sort of a shop. So compared with the Poles in Berlin, there was a sort of a greater sense of a desire to maintain sort of a Polish national consciousness. But again, there was very little sense of queer diasporic consciousness. I mean, as Anka put it, well, there isn't really anything Polish about being gay, and there's not really anything gay about being Polish. So she didn't understand why you would need to specifically have a group just for gay Poles. But whereas in Berlin with the Russians, there was sort of the ethnic Russian community and then there was the gay community, and they didn't really meet. Dariusz would argue that actually sort of in Berlin and London, the gay Poles and the straight Poles would mix much more than was sort of the case with the Russians. So he points out that, you know, we had a lot of gay friends in Krakow, but that's because in Poland, the straight friends and the gay friends, they didn't really mix. Whereas he was sort of talking about London in this case. But over here, it's not so important if you're gay or not. So you can have fun and say stupid things about guys, how they dress or something. So he was sort of talking about sort of his his straight friends, both sort of British and Polish. And this sort of leads me then to the next sort of part of the talk, which is trying to understand why sort of Polish straight men in this case are more likely to be sort of less intolerant in London compared with their home countries. So we did research, this was sort of the much larger research project, the large quantitative research project of 2,500, and we asked people about their attitudes towards homosexuality, and particularly sort of marked it in terms of how long they had been in London. And what we found was that the longer they were living in London, the less intolerant of homosexuality they became, until about 4 years, where it sort of plateaued. when we looked at individual countries, we looked at Poland, Romania and Lithuania, because they're the three biggest East European communities in London. And we found that actually people became a bit more intolerant once they arrived, but then after that they became less intolerant over time. And when we were trying to explain that, and we thought perhaps it could be to do with the fact just of sort of greater visibility, it might just be the shock of the new, but also because if you're going to engage with the ethnic diaspora, then that is much more likely to happen at the beginning of your sort of migration journey, particularly if you don't know the language, you have few friends, you're having trouble finding a job, and as we've said, ethno-national diasporas do tend to be sort of more traditional and homophobic. But the more they integrated, the less intolerant they became. And so there was sort of a number of sort of key reasons that we thought sort of migration has a positive impact on sort of attitudes. And the first was simply the fact that as a result of migration, you're sort of extricated from the influence of negative discourse. So in Poland, and particularly in Russia, the media, politicians and the church would regularly sort of say negative things about gay people. So simply by being out of that context, you're sort of not hearing these negative messages being repeated again and again. So Laima, a Latvian woman, said, you know, I think in my country people still have problems accepting homosexuality, and of course here it's totally normal. Also simply the visibility, sort of the Polish and the Russians said that there was sort of no representation of sort of gay people, or very little representation of gay people in the media, and you sort of never saw it, so you sort of couldn't sort of process it. Whereas in the UK, there was sort of much more sort of visible. So Piret said, you know, in Estonia homosexuality wasn't so open, so I just wasn't used to it because you didn't see it. And similarly, Jarek gave us lots of great quotes. So he said, I don't know if you know that Brighton is the English capital of gay men. I wasn't aware of this when I moved there, but in general, I must say that it even helped, because I was negative towards gay men, and now I'm indifferent. So just sort of being around, sort of being in contact, or sort of seeing, having greater visibility, sort of had a positive impact. But the greatest impact was actually personal contact. If people were sort of working with sort of LGBT individuals, became friends with LGBT individuals, this sort of helped break down the stereotypes that they had grown up with. In ethnic conflict studies, this is known as the contact hypothesis, so that if you sort of actually have personal experience, personal friendships with somebody from the other group, then it's much more difficult to sort of maintain these sort of negative stereotypes. And a lot of the people we spoke to said, you know, like Nina, I don't really ever remember having met a homosexual, you know, in a home country. And again, Jarek. So I had a few friends and I didn't know that they were gay, and I learned this too late when they were my friend already. So I decided, okay, I would have reacted to it some years ago, but here it's normal, and I had to get used to it. So that was effective in a way. But what we sort of found interesting with Snezhana, this Bulgarian woman, was that she sort of had gay friends, but no lesbian friends. So her attitudes towards gay men changed, but because she had no personal contact with lesbians, she still maintained these stereotypes about lesbians. So she said, I haven't had many contacts with gay women. To be honest, I prefer gay men. I get along well with them. The gay women I have seen mostly look sullen. So she has no personal contact, therefore these sort of stereotypical ideas are maintained. So while in general the attitude was sort of positive, nevertheless there were certain sort of limitations. Sort of when we sort of looked at particularly the qualitative data, we found that there were sort of certain limitations in these sort of more positive attitudes. Firstly, women were more likely to be sort of positive and to be positively sort of changed, although that is sort of true sort of in general. But what was particularly interesting was the type of gays and lesbians that they were sort of more positive about. So if they were sort of gender conforming, then that was something that the respondents found more easy to deal with. If they were not gender conforming, then the stereotypes and the negative attitudes prevailed. So Lisu, so I have nothing against homosexuals. I wouldn't even mind trying a girl myself. But what I don't like, especially about women, I don't like they try to behave like a man, this kind of hairy woman. And again, János, for me, a woman should be feminine and a man should be manly. So even, you know, if there's a manly homosexual and a sort of a feminine lesbian, that's fine. But if they sort of mix those up, then that is when it's problematic. Jarek again, I saw two lesbians in Brighton who reminded me more of men than women, and this was repulsive. So Jarek was the man who's sort of actually friends with sort of a gay man and sort of attitudes. He admits that his attitudes have changed, but clearly there are sort of limits. And for him, it was the sort of the gender conformity. Also, I mean, Lisu sort of expressed again sort of that her attitudes had changed, but again there were sort of limits, particularly with regard to sort of full sexual citizenship. I don't understand why they need to have a gay parade. Heterosexual people don't have a parade, so why do you need to advertise? Also, there was an idea that I mean, Ava sort of reported it secondhand. She was talking about her male Polish friends, who she says their attitudes haven't changed. They might say that they've changed because they're in England. They know you can't be as blatantly homophobic in England as you can be in Poland. So she said most of the Polish guys I know, they're against homosexuality. Now when they're in England, they say, okay, no problem, but they're still against it. And also, a sort of a more positive attitude isn't the same as sort of fully accepting. So Felix, he was a policeman in Poland, and he sort of told us that he was very homophobic when he was a policeman, that he actually used to sort of harass sort of gay men, and that his attitudes have changed for the better since coming to the UK. But you know, now he says, I don't mind them as long as I have nothing to do with them. So it's not like he's sort of seeking to sort of become friends with gay people, but you know, if he doesn't have to deal with them, then he won't go out of his way to sort of beat up gay men as he used to in Poland. So just to sort of sum up the final section, we found that in general migration did have a positive attitude, that people were sort of re-socialized into new norms regarding sex and sexuality, and sometimes it meant that even if their core beliefs hadn't changed, they were sort of socialized into sort of not vocalizing it. Actual visibility, and in particular contact with sort of the other, sort of had the biggest impact. And also the fact that there was sort of broader sort of public and media discussion of sex and sexuality in the UK. Sort of politicians would discuss it. You know, even gay marriage was brought in the UK by the Conservatives of all people. So all sort of spectrums sort of now generally support sort of gay marriage and sort of gay equality. But there was at least a sort of a recognition that we were sort of just talking about London. That if you go to sort of smaller towns and cities outside, then a lot of the more traditional attitudes will still prevail. Whereas London is a sort of a big, fast-paced city, so the fact that they think attitudes are more liberal towards gay people may just be because people are too busy to sort of care about other people's sort of sexual identities. With regard to sort of the earlier sort of part of the presentation, so sexuality does seem to be a significant factor in explaining why a lot of LGBT people migrate. But what we've seen is that even if people do want to migrate, there's only certain categories of individual that are able to do that. Primarily those with high cultural and economic capital. For the Poles, it was less of an issue because everybody could sort of migrate if they wanted to, and so there was a sort of a much broader mix. But among the Russians and then among the Brazilians, who I haven't discussed today, it was really only the richer, sort of economically much better off that could afford to do it, or those that had a very good education and therefore could use their sort of cultural capital to sort of do a postgraduate sort of research in the UK or in Germany. Whereas a lot of those who may have been in the same situation but simply didn't have that cultural or economic capital were unable to sort of use that as a mechanism of dealing with the homophobia in their own countries. Okay, so thank you for your attention.